For his entire life, Harold had only known his great-uncle, Father Raymond, through a single, faded photograph and the family story that he had simply abandoned his faith and walked away in 1925. But a letter from a New England diocese changes everything, speaking of architectural oddities found during a church renovation. Now, standing in the dust-filled sanctuary of St. Jude's, Harold looks at a gaping hole behind the old altar, a space that was never on any blueprint. The foreman tells him they found something inside, something they couldn't explain. It's amazing how a single discovery can shatter a story you've been told your whole life. We're about to explore a mystery that was sealed in stone for decades, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as we uncover the truth together. So stick around and let me know what you think. The year was 1953. Harold stood in the cold, cavernous space of the church, the air thick with the smell of old stone and fresh dust. As a history professor, he was used to sifting through the remains of the past, but this was different. This was personal. The foreman, a burly man named Gus with plaster dust in his eyebrows, led him past drop cloths and scaffolding to the altar. "Right here," Gus said, pointing his thumb at the dark, rectangular hole in the wall. "My boys were taking down the old lathe and plaster to reinforce the stone, and they found it. This section was bricked up from the inside. Sealed tight." Gus gestured to a wooden crate resting on a nearby pew. Inside, nestled on a bed of dirty rags, was the object they had found. It was a communion chalice, or what was left of one. The silver was tarnished and blackened, the cup itself crushed inward, and the stem was twisted into a grotesque spiral, as if it had been subjected to unimaginable heat and pressure. It was warped, but it was undeniably a chalice. Harold leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. There on the tarnished base was a small, intricate engraving he recognized instantly, the crest of his mother's family. A small bird clutched in its talons a single olive branch. He had the same crest on his great-grandfather's signet ring. The family story had always been simple and shameful. Father Raymond, the bright, promising young priest, had suffered a crisis of faith. One Sunday in October of 1925, he gave Mass, and the next morning he was gone. His room was cleared of personal effects, and a brief, unsigned note was left on his desk, saying he was leaving to find a different path. The church and the family accepted it, bearing the embarrassment under decades of silence. But looking at the brutalized chalice, Harold knew that story was a lie. A priest who abandons his calling might take his clothes, but he doesn't leave his sacred chalice to be sealed inside a wall. And he certainly doesn't melt it first. He had a new goal now, a mission that felt both academic and deeply personal. He had to piece together the last days of Father Raymond and discover why someone would go to such lengths to erase him. His investigation began not in the small Massachusetts town, but an hour's drive away at the diocesan archives. The building was quiet and smelled of aging paper. A young, helpful clerk brought him the files for St. Jude's Parish, covering the years 1920 to 1930. For hours, Harold sat at a long oak table, carefully turning brittle pages. He found financial ledgers, baptismal records, and sermon notes. Father Raymond's notes were filled with passionate, flowing script, quoting not just the Bible, but philosophers and poets. He wrote of the church's duty to the poor, especially the mill workers who made up most of the town's population. His sermons were about social justice, compassion in action, and the dignity of labor. Then Harold found what he was looking for, a folder of official correspondence. Tucked inside was a series of letters between Father Raymond and the parish deacon at the time, a man named Bernard. The tone of the letters was chilling. Deacon Bernard's handwriting was sharp and angry. He accused Raymond of preaching modernist heresy and turning the pulpit into a socialist soapbox. Bernard wrote that the church's only concern should be the salvation of souls, not the wages of mill workers. The final letter, dated just 2 days before Raymond's disappearance, was from the deacon. It was a formal complaint to the bishop, calling Father Raymond a dangerous radical who was poisoning the parish. The conflict was far more severe than anyone in Harold's family had ever let on. Harold knew his next step was to find someone who remembered these two men, not as names on a page, but as people. He drove back to the town of Auburn, to its small historical society. The curator, a kind woman who seemed to know everyone, helped him pull up the parish rosters from 1925. As he scanned the list of names, he felt a growing sense of futility. Most of these people would be long gone. But the curator pointed to one name. Beulah, she said. She's still around. Lives over on Chestnut Street. Sharp as a tack, but doesn't get out much anymore. He found Beulah sitting on her porch, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the mild autumn air. She was a tiny woman with bright, intelligent eyes that lit up when he mentioned Father Raymond. "Oh, he was a wonderful man," she said, her voice a soft, crackling whisper. "He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. He talked to us, the mill workers, like we mattered. Not like the deacon." "Deacon Bernard?" Harold asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Beulah's expression soured. "A cold man. Hard as the granite in the quarry. He looked at us like we were insects. He believed suffering on earth was good for the soul, especially if it was someone else's suffering. He and Father Raymond, they were like oil and water. The deacon was always watching him, always muttering after his sermons." Harold felt a jolt of adrenaline. He was on the right path. He described the sealed vault found behind the altar. Beulah nodded slowly, a distant memory flickering in her eyes. "I remember that," she said. "The week after the father disappeared, the deacon got a few men from the parish together. He said there were cracks in the foundation, that the back wall needed shoring up. They were back there for days, mixing concrete. The deacon oversaw it all himself. He said he was saving the church money by not hiring a contractor." She looked at Harold, her eyes wide with a dawning horror she hadn't understood for 28 years. No one questioned it. He was the deacon, after all. The pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. The doctrinal dispute, the bitter letters, the convenient disappearance, and the deacon himself personally sealing a wall right where the chalice was found. Bernard hadn't been making a repair. He had been building a tomb. Beulah gave him one last crucial piece of information. "The deacon had a son," she said quietly. "Lawrence, a quiet, nervous boy. He was about 16 then, always in his father's shadow, always looked terrified. I think he left town not long after." Finding Lawrence became Harold's obsession. It took him 2 weeks of digging through records, census data, military enlistments, marriage licenses. He finally tracked him down to a small town in upstate New York where he worked as a bookkeeper. Harold knew he couldn't just call. This was a conversation that had to happen face to face. He packed a small bag, placed the warped chalice carefully in a box, and began the 6-hour drive north. He found Lawrence living in a modest, tidy house. The man who answered the door was in his mid-40s with a gaunt face and the same haunted, fearful eyes Beulah had described from his youth. "My name is Harold. I'm Father Raymond's great-nephew," Harold began. Lawrence's face went pale. He started to shut the door, but Harold was faster. "They found something at the church," he said, holding his ground, "something that belonged to him." Lawrence froze. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at Harold with a look of pure terror. Finally he sagged against the doorframe and whispered, "I knew this day would come. I always knew." He let Harold inside. They sat in a dim, silent living room. Harold didn't need to ask questions. He simply opened the box and placed the twisted silver chalice on the coffee table between them. The sight of it seemed to break something inside Lawrence. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a wave of grief and exhaustion, as if a weight he'd been carrying for nearly 30 years had suddenly become too heavy to bear. "My father was a righteous man," Lawrence began, his voice trembling. "In his own mind, he was an instrument of God. He saw the world in black and white, good and evil. And to him, Father Raymond was evil." He told the story of that final Sunday. The argument started in the sacristy right after Mass. Lawrence had been there, clearing away the vestments. His father and the priest were arguing about Raymond's plan to use parish donations to start a fund for the families of striking mill workers. To Deacon Bernard, this was theft. It was using God's money for a political, worldly cause. "The priest wouldn't back down," Lawrence said, his eyes fixed on the warped chalice. "He told my father that serving the poor was the church's most sacred duty. He called my father a Pharisee, more concerned with rules than with people." The argument escalated. Voices were raised. It spilled out from the sacristy into the sanctuary. Deacon Bernard grabbed a heavy, ornate brass candlestick from a side altar. "He told the priest he was driving the devil from the house of God," Lawrence whispered, tears now streaming down his face. And then he swung it. He described the sickening sound, the priest falling to the stone floor. There was no time to think. His father was a man possessed. He grabbed Lawrence, his fingers digging into his arm like talons, and told him that a great evil had been purged from the church. He said that Father Raymond was a heretic and that God himself had passed judgment. Panicked, Bernard dragged the priest's body into the small, dusty alcove behind the main altar, a space used for storing old banners. He forced Lawrence to help him. The next day, Deacon Bernard told the parish that the priest had packed his bags and fled in the night, a coward who had abandoned his flock, and everyone believed him. Over the next week, Bernard worked tirelessly, mixing bag after bag of concrete. But first, he did something else. In the dead of night, he poured kerosene into the alcove. He wanted to erase every trace of Father Raymond, to burn the body and purify the space. But the stone alcove was too airtight. The fire consumed the oxygen and choked itself out, succeeding only in charring the body and subjecting the silver chalice to an intense, contained blast of heat that twisted it into the unrecognizable shape Harold now held. Then, brick by brick, Bernard sealed the wall. He made Lawrence help him, telling him that if the secret ever came out, they would both hang, and their souls would be damned for eternity. Deacon Bernard had died of a heart attack in 1943, taking his secret to the grave and leaving his son to carry the burden alone. With Lawrence's signed and witnessed confession, Harold went back to the Massachusetts State Police. The gears of justice, frozen for 28 years, began to turn. A forensics team, accompanied by diocesan officials, returned to St. Jude's. They carefully dismantled the brick wall Deacon Bernard had built with such terrible purpose. Inside the dark, soot-stained vault, they found the remains of a man. Dental records confirmed it was Father Raymond. The story was finally brought into the light. Father Raymond hadn't been a deserter. He had been a martyr, killed for his conviction that faith without works is dead. He was given a hero's burial in the church cemetery, his headstone telling the true story of his service and sacrifice. For Harold's family, the resolution brought a profound and aching sense of peace. The shame they had carried for a generation was lifted, replaced by pride. Harold often visited his great-uncle's grave. He had not just solved a mystery, he had reclaimed a legacy. He had found the truth, not in an archive or a textbook, but in the echoes of a violent argument and in a twisted piece of silver that refused to be forgotten. So here's something to think about. Deacon Bernard acted out of what he believed was a defense of his faith, convinced he was doing God's work. Does a sincere, albeit twisted, belief justify a monstrous act, or does it make the crime even worse? I'm really interested to read your take on that in the comments, and if you found this journey into the past as compelling as I did, consider subscribing and joining us for more stories where the truth is often buried just beneath the surface. We'll see you next time.